Welcome. Thank you all for coming. I'm so sorry I couldn't be there in person with you today. I'm Melissa Barnett. I'm the director of the Francis McClelland Institute for Children, Youth, and Families, or FMI, as we refer to ourselves. We're glad that you could join us for today's talk. Before I turn it over to our guest speaker, I do just want to provide a little bit of information. And Bianca, if you could forward the slide. Thank you. So this is today's presenter. And I do want to start by acknowledging where we are. Oh, first of all, I'll tell you about some upcoming FMI events. So actually yesterday we had a workshop. We have next Friday, basically the same time as this today. We hope you can join us for a GIS for evaluation or workshop. That will be a great opportunity for some hands-on learning. And then our final event of the semester, since we're that late in the semester at this point, is our spring student poster showcase, which will be at the end of April. And you can always find out about our events and everything else we're doing on our website, fmi.arizona.edu. And before we get any further, I do want to acknowledge where we are in Tucson, Arizona by sharing the official land acknowledgement of the University of Arizona. We respectfully acknowledge the University of Arizona is on the land and territories of Indigenous peoples. Today, Arizona is home to 22 federally recognized tribes, with Tucson being home to the O'odham and the Yaqui. Committed to diversity and inclusion, the university strives to build sustainable relationships with sovereign Native nations and Indigenous communities through education offerings, partnerships, and community service. And next, I want to tell you a little bit about FMI. So our goal is to contribute to building strong communities that support family resilience so that children, youth, and families, especially those who experience marginalization, have the opportunity to thrive. And we do this by supporting innovative research, actively partnering with community organizations, sharing research findings with practitioners in the community, and educating the next generation of engaged scholars and leaders. All of the work that we do is to honor the legacy of Francis McClelland. Francis was a University of Arizona alum. She was also a very generous and tireless philanthropist. She understood and facilitated resilience. She lived a life that demonstrated resilience and wanted to create other opportunities for individuals who experience disadvantages in life to meet their full potential. I also want to acknowledge the contributions to the Pamela J. Turbeville Speaker Series. We are so pleased to have the ongoing support of Pam Turbeville, who is also a Norton School alum and a real asset to the university community as a whole. Thank you to Pam. And then finally, the real reason you came today was to hear today's talk. And I'm so glad to have Dr. Gonzalez join us. He's been collecting data here in the Lang Family Lab, which is one of the resources FMI offers, and been so curious about what he's been doing in that lab with his grad students. So can't wait to hear some of those results. Dr. Gonzalez is an assistant professor in the School of Government and Public Policy here at the U of A. He received his PhD in political science at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. He studies political psychology with a particular focus on the psychological mechanisms that lead to the propagation of inequality and intolerance in American politics. Clearly a timely topic. Frank uses a variety of methods such as large-scale surveys, laboratory experiments, implicit attitude measures of non-conscious and biological processes like skin conductance and magnetic resonance imaging, or MRI, and more, to investigate how humans process information related to inequality and politics. He has been published in top academic journals in political science, psychology, and biology. And so thank you. We are so pleased to have you here today, and I will turn it over to you, Dr. Gonzalez.
All right. Thank you. Thanks, everybody, for coming. I'll grab that clicker. Unless you need it. Sorry, I don't know. Thank you for the introduction, Melissa, and thanks for, that's perfect. All of that. I don't know, as long as you can see the slides, I guess that's the important thing. I'll sort of like try to be verbal. I'm an assistant professor in the School of Government and Public Policy, as Dr. Barnett mentioned. And you guys have all been kind enough to allow me to use the Lang Lab to collect data And I think the mission of the project overlaps a bit with some of the work that you all do. I know we're, different departments, and I recognize some of the faces, but only because I pressured my graduate students to come attend as well. But for those of you who I don't know, I did stalk your web pages a bit, so I see that there's some overlap, I think, in interest. So hopefully that is interesting to you, and you find some connections here, or can also give some feedback maybe for the paper and the project as it continues, based on like a multidisciplinary perspective or whatever you guys think. So the project, aside from just hanging out in the lab, no, I'm kidding. We're doing research, but the project is about the relationship between, I'm saying responsiveness to threat here, but eventually I'm going to transition to calling it negativity bias. And I'll define that, and political attitudes, in particular political conservatism. And that's a literature that exists before me, and our contribution is really looking at the role of race and ethnicity here, and sort of trying to look at it beyond sort of, and this is, I'm far from the first one to say this, but beyond just sort of like a dummy variable that you throw in a control variable, and sort of like a fundamental way that people view the world and society and political institutions. So that's me, but I also, everything that I'm talking about here has been in collaboration with my lab, the Psychology of Inequality and Politics lab, which we have some members here today. Fatih Erol is our SGPP research scientist, who's been extremely helpful in continuing to run this. He's probably there more than I am now. And Rong Bo-jin and Ian Wang are just set to graduate, but they were running it before that. So I owe them a great deal of gratitude, as well as you guys in the Francis McClellan Institute. But I don't know if you can see that, but that was the talk at was that the RNC when she kind of, okay, you can see that. So the basic question is, how does threat sensitivity affect political attitudes? And I'll kind of, again, like I said, switch to negativity bias. But I'll say here, just because I'm not sure what everybody's background is, so what I study is political psychology. And basically, I don't think that psychology is the end all be all of everything, but I studied the psychological component of the stuff. And what I'm particularly interested in personally is how people think about inequality, race and class specifically, but also just in general. But in my graduate training, we did a lot of work on just sort of the political psychology of ideology and people's left-right leanings generally. Sorry, I did not the most confident on timing, so I might neurotically look at my timer a bit. So that's where this starts, this question that many have looked at in political psychology of, are there biological predispositions or tendencies that people have that lean them one way or another in terms of conservative or liberal? And what I'm going to ultimately focus on is bringing in my interest in class and race, well, not class here, but just race and ethnicity into this. But before that, I will pause for showing you the outline of the talk. I'm going to talk a little bit really broadly, because this is an interdisciplinary audience, about where political attitudes come from. And that's sort of the fundamental question, really, underlying all of this literature. And I'm going to introduce you to sort of one of the subfields that this stems from, which is called biopolitics, which sounds controversial, I guess, for lack of a better term at first, but I'll sort of explain what that is and what recent work in that field is. And that's the literature that I sort of like gotten really involved with in my graduate training. Negativity bias and the relationship between that and political conservatism. So where does that actually, what is the literature suggesting that that's a thing? And then bringing in race and ethnicity to this and how that might shape these understandings. So I'm going to talk to you, the real like true results I'm going to show you are from study 1, which has already been published. So I like save your criticism. No, I'm just kidding. That's still relevant. It's still ongoing in study 2, but study 1 has data. So I wanted to show you some actual results. But it's very limited in a variety of ways, as I'll explain. And then I'm going to try and show you what I'll call preliminary results, but really like, so we've been working on this for a while, but we still don't have enough people to really look at much. So I don't have physiology and results to show you, even though that's kind of like the coolest thing and what the Lang lab allows me to do. But we are collecting some other data to measure negativity bias. We have like a memory recall task we as people do. I'll show you some initial results from that are underpowered and you shouldn't tell anybody else about because they'll probably change as I collect more data. But I wanted to show you that things are happening down there. And then like what our next steps are. These are my kids, as some of you have met them, Rocco and Charlie. And so I guess this is my cheeky way of saying like, why do I like what's really going on here? Where do people's political preferences come from? They have very strong political attitudes at this age. No, I'm just kidding. They right. So we don't know, like they don't have anything right now. They might have some leanings or general value systems that are being developed or something along those lines. But what work in political psychology for decades has been interested in, not in kids in particular necessarily, but where do political attitudes come from? They've largely pointed to factors that become relevant in adulthood, because that's when people start thinking and caring about politics. The first thing, which I don't know, depending on your background, might seem more or less satirical, is logic and reason. So if I were to ask you guys, like, where do you think your political attitudes come from? I think a lot of people still hold on to this, right? Like if I were to literally ask very well-educated people who might have an interest in politics and follow politics and watch the news, like, why do you think this? You're not going to be like, I don't know, I just sort of fell through, you know, I bounced around between an interaction of my personality characteristics and the environment, and this is where I am. Take it or leave it. No, you think that there's some good reason or logical reason behind it. And there's, you know, and I'm not saying that that doesn't exist, but a lot of other stuff exists also, right? Which we tend to, these are things that we tend to acknowledge. So we call these socialization factors, and that's been the predominant view of where political attitudes come from, is various aspects of your socialization, environmental factors, things that come from outside. Your parents, school, religion, friends, media, in particular. Oh, right. So this sort of assumes implicitly, although I think a lot of the scholars on this wouldn't say that this is true, but if these are the only factors we look at, we're thinking a blank slate, tabula rasa, for the political mind and where your political attitudes are come from. If any person was in that situation with that set of political events and life experiences, then they would have the same political attitudes. And I think socialization matters a lot. Sorry, I was trying to remember why I'm showing these pictures. I'm just going to show you pictures of my kids for 40 minutes. So this is Rocco doing karate. And oh, right. So parents, like I think about the role of parents a lot in some of the other work, especially because I have young kids, and I'm constantly paranoid about what toxic stuff I'm like putting into them accidentally. So we had, Rocco started doing Taekwondo, and I was like, what am I doing? Why am I teaching my son to fight? And it's like this hyper masculine thing. Charlie is always walking around like she wears these dresses and brings purses around. So I'm like, we're hyper gendering these kids from a very young age. And then I give myself credit. I'm like, well, sometimes, Rocco likes to put on makeup every now and then. I don't know what the hell Charlie's doing, but something else. She got socks on her hand and decided that she'll only eat chips with socks on her hands. I don't know if that has to do with gender, but it's not socialized. We didn't teach her to do that. So there's other things potentially, right? And this becomes controversial for a variety of reasons. Happy to talk more about through the presentation, but also like in the Q&A, because a lot of these questions do come up. But what about individual traits and predispositions? So even potentially biological things, like physiological things. So one of the models that we had sort of put forward was, so we were saying that we're challenging this sort of basic only environment, pure socialization model of political attitudes. So the idea that it's, you have early life events and then other events, stimuli from your environment that are continuing to impact you. And it's filtered through your identities, right? What groups you belong to, and maybe the lasting remnants of political events from the past. And that ultimately is where your political beliefs and actions come from. And what we're saying is that we're just broadening that, right? We're broadening that to be, well, there's predisposition. So on the left side, it's not just early life events, but there's early development. There's even some really interesting stuff about like neonatal development, not on politics, but just in like the hormones that you're exposed to and things like that. But there is also a genetics part of this, which I will conveniently dodge for a lot of this talk because it tends to overtake the conversation, but I'm happy to talk about it in the Q&A. But there is some work that suggests that there's a heritable portion of what ultimately becomes political attitudes, not like your attitudes on the Affordable Care Act per se, but some predispositions or personality traits that ultimately lean people one way or another. But also all these events are being filtered throughout your life through whatever predispositions you have, different traits and personality characteristics, consciously and non-consciously. And that occurs throughout the lifespan. So there's a variety of predispositions that political psychologists have looked at in terms of actually seem to be quite predictive of political attitudes. And generally, we can broaden this a lot, but here let's just think about the left-right continuum, which can be more complicated. Some people say it's more than left-right, but just for now, just generally liberal versus conservative. The Big Five personality questionnaire has been really predictive of this. So things like openness to experiences is pretty robustly correlated with being left of center politically. Conscientiousness, on the other hand, is pretty robustly associated with being right of center. There's even this really interesting, this is a tangent that was unplanned, but that'll ruin my timing. But I feel the need to. So there was this really cool study where they looked at the rooms, the living quarters of liberals and conservatives, and they found that like liberals had much messier apartments than conservatives, and that sort of like just seemed to reflect this. I don't know. I won't stand, but I don't know. I'm not going to defend the rigor of that study, but it fits the idea, right? Need for cognition and analytical thinking. I've done some work on this. It turns out that's also controversial when you start saying that one group is more analytical than the other. But there is a small but robust relationship between being left of center politically and having higher tendency toward analytical versus intuitive thinking. Need for closure. So the need for black and white things to be sort of resolved and have structure is associated with being right of center. Authoritarianism is actually one of my colleagues, Chris Weber in SGPP, is one of the leading people on this, and will show you that authoritarianism is one of the biggest predictors in American politics today. More so increasing every election cycle, it seems. Social dominance orientation, which is related to that. There's also a bunch of values that people look at. So your general proclivity toward universalism or individualism, how much you value things like purity and heritability. Even some of the estimates are at like 25 to 40%. These are like pretty rigorous, like state-of-the-art behavioral genetics stuff. But again, I'm dodging that for now. Don't worry about it. And then what we're going to focus on is threat sensitivity. And this has some literature behind it too. I'm also going to call it negativity bias. And so back to the original question, threat sensitivity, if that's a thing, how much do you respond to threats in your environment? People vary in this. Everybody tends to do it, but people vary in the degree. And you might think just anecdotally how much you react versus a friend of yours or your partner or other people when a car screeches in front of you, almost hit you. You see a variety of reactions, right? Or when there's a potential threat around you, some people get really into fight or flight mode, and other people seem to just be kind of blasé about it. We can think about how this relates to politics. So on the one hand, the hypothesis that's mainly been levied, and spoiler alert, has seen the most support, is that this is related to the political right. Oh, those went by too fast. I'm gonna do it here. Right, and we just think of current issues, right? Conspiracy theories, the Benghazi and the deep state, anything that Blake sorry, I don't know. I should have researched the backgrounds of people. I don't know, but Blake Masters, right, Senate candidate, lives like right down the street. Really into threat, right? Always has a gun, and lots of. I got this mailer that I thought was. I kept getting mailers with pictures of bathrooms, and I was like, why? And it turns out it's a whole anti-trans thing, right? And then even going back, that's a poster, billboard from like the 50s, right? Which is like, they're coming for your white women kind of thing with like a brownish hand with claws. So this is all racialized as well, obviously. But maybe we're oversimplifying it. Liberals are more afraid of climate change and COVID and burning climate change and potential impending dictators, right? So sorry, is this recorded? No. So negativity bias is, so this has been studied. So what people started doing is studying, is this a real thing, even outside of the domain of politics in terms of the threats. So negativity bias in psychology is just a tendency for adverse events and stimuli in your environment to have more of a significant impact on your psychological state than positive events. And simple, plain words, what that means is reacting more to negative things. Like theoretically, everybody has negativity bias, and you tend to see this, that people do that on average. They react more strongly to negative things than positive things. If a threat is in your environment versus like a teddy bear, it makes more sense for you to react to the threat because that could threaten your life. But there's variation, and we see variation across people. And a few studies, well, a bunch of studies starting in like the early 2000s have linked this to political conservatism. So this idea that, yeah, it is a right-wing type of thing. Some studies use eye tracking. So they found that liberals, so they show people apolitical images, nothing with politics. So disgusting images like a mutilated body or vomit, threatening images like a gun pointed at the screen or a knife, and then neutral images like a plate or a chair, and then positive images like a cute baby or a beautiful landscape. And they showed them all on the screen at the same time, like 4 quadrants, and conservatives their eyes literally moved to the negative picture more quickly than liberals and stayed on the negative picture for longer. We also have some MRI data. I do some MRI work. The basic idea that this research has found is that like amygdala activation, which is the amygdala is sort of the emotional detection center of the brain. Something happens in your environment, you attune to it. This lit up more strongly for conservatives than for liberals when they showed them aversive images. There's also some data, a lot of data actually, because it's been replicated across countries, that people right of center have larger amygdalas, structurally larger amygdalas. That doesn't mean like, anytime you think like this biological stuff is like, whoa, you're saying like some eugenicsy stuff here, but that definitely not, right? It's not an inborn different species thing. In fact, these structural differences can be socialized over time. There's a study that showed that like London cab drivers, their hippocampus grows over time because of how much they're engaging long-term memory, right? So we don't know where this comes from, but those differences are there. Electrodermal activity, which is what we're collecting downstairs, thanks to the Lang Lab, and it's skin conductance. It's also called. It's how much sweat production under the skin is occurring when at any given point. It's activation of your autonomic nervous system, so your fight or flight system goes off, and you start producing. Anytime this happens, it's happening all the time, probably right now to different degrees. An imperceptible change in how much sweat is produced under your skin, even if you can't feel it. And you can measure that through these sensors. Memory recall, which is what I'm going to show you some data from. You show people a bunch of negative, positive, and neutral images and see if they remember the negative ones more. And sure enough, what we found way back 8 years ago was that conservatives remembered negative images more accurately than positive images, and this was greater for conservatives than for liberals. But there's been some replication problems, as has been the case in a lot of different fields. But in this case, there was some really rigorous, and there was no bad blood or anything here at all. These are actually, there's a lot of, these are good friends, like all these researchers. But so they went out and tried to replicate this in much larger samples, and they couldn't. So this one was only the Netherlands and the US on the top, and then on the bottom, that's a study across 17 countries. I don't know how they got the grant money for this, but 17 different countries. They measured the physiological, they used EDA, and they measured how much people react to negative and positive images, their political attitudes, did all this stuff about how left and right means different things in the different countries and all this, and still you just can't replicate, even in the US, this idea that people who respond more physiologically to threatening images or negative images are more conservative. But they only did that. All these replication attempts have been through EDA. For some reason, we're fascinated with that in the political psychology research, but they haven't attempted with the other methods. So what is threat? sorry, I hope that doesn't, like, I'm not going to go into like a weird giant philosophical thing here. But what is the threat we're talking about? And this is where I think the role of race and ethnicity comes into play. What is the threat that people that are high in negativity bias or threat responsive are connecting to politics, right? And so in the existing studies, you see a lot of the assumption, there's some of these assumptions are implicit, and sometimes they say it out loud, which is like, well, what is it that's so threatening that conservative policies or Republicans or whatever it is offering safety from? Criminals, outsiders or foreigners and immigrants, free riders, if you want to bring it to the economic realm, this idea of like societal leeches, and gender and sexual deviance. So people seen as violating the sort of heteronormative status quo. And that's sort of the threat. In fact, if you actually look close at a lot of these studies, they find the strongest effects for things that have to do with that last one. That's really what's driving some of these, or a lot of these results, if you look at their appendices, in these papers. You see, it's really like, attitudes towards gay marriage and abortion even, and anything related to gender that could possibly connect it to religion as well. The social sort of issues are really where you see the strongest connection between negativity bias and ideology on these studies. But in terms of protection from the threat, then theoretically, we're looking at police or strict law enforcement that protects you from criminals. Hawkish views toward international relations. There's some studies are about like terrorism, and like you're more conservative on issues related to terrorism and interrogation and stuff like that. If you are threat sensitive. Immigration laws and rigid borders, that's protection, security, right? Laissez-faire economics, that's kind of an odd one. And I actually am super interested in that in particular. But I think the theory, at least, is that this is protection from free riders. There's some like evolutionary psych sort of theories that have been used to try and make that argument. And then religious traditions and strict gender roles and sexual norms, protection of the nuclear family, the heteronormative nuclear family, right? Where there's sort of like a clean, rule-based division of labor between domestic, labor and compensated labor. That is protection, right, from these norm deviations. But I've always thought, like, this seems really white. This is really what you would think amongst white people in particular. And I was thinking, like, why is that? Why does that seem to be? Well, I mean, the samples and research teams have tended to be white, right? And so that's sort of the baseline. It's sort of assumed to be the modal group that's relevant here. But we know that everything you think about social institutions, how you view government or particular political institutions like the police or immigration are fundamentally structured and shaped by your place in the social hierarchy. And here we're talking about racial hierarchy. So the idea that undergirds this study is that the relationship between negativity bias and ideology probably depends on your place in the racial hierarchy. And it's a bit complicated then to locate people on that, but so we think, well, I'll explain more. But we focus here on 4 racial groups, and there's a lot to be missed here, and various multiracial identities and things like that. But just to try and get a start at saying, does race matter here, we looked at non-Hispanic white participants, African American, Latinx, and Asian American. And another thing that's important here, given this distinction we're making, is that existing work combines this all. A lot of times it's this scale from like the late 60s that combines your attitudes towards like 20 different issues all over the place. Abortion, welfare, immigration, it's all just crammed together, averaged together, and that's your conservative or liberal ideology. However, if what we're saying here about race and ethnicity is the case, then we probably want to split it up into different issue domains. This might manifest differently for policing and criminal justice issues versus immigration issues, or economic redistribution, or we're calling it religious conservatism. So for policing, right? The police, so this might be kind of straightforward, but basically, right, there's a ton of literature. I don't like, I'm in like a period of where I feel like in presentations, like showing you the citations is just an added text. So I've done that, but then I regret it sometimes. I'm like, maybe they think I'm making it up, but there's tons of citations, right? The police, okay, so in general, the idea, right, is that the police and harsh punitive criminal justice policies represent security from threat to white people. But we know that they are often perceived as a threat to Black and brown people. And this has been, you know, we can show that they are, you know, in a variety of ways in terms of, you know, encounters with the police and experiences in the criminal justice system, also the motivations behind why these different types of punitive policies were put into place in the first place. But also it's been highlighted. So we're looking at the average person. Does that actually translate to them feeling threatened? It tends to, right? So surveys and polls show that Black and brown individuals are much more threatened by the police, for example, than white people who tend to see them as security. In social movements, we have the Black Lives Matter movement, and these social movements occur throughout time. They remind us of what the relationship is between the criminal justice system or the police and your group. Asian Americans, we have it in the paper like it's more complicated, right? We think, maybe. There's all these assimilation processes. They're often stereotyped as the model minorities, which means they obey the law, and they are, you know, often considered like honorary whites. In some of this literature, there's a whole literature on the whitening. Well, I don't know. I know a lot of you study, so you probably know more than I do. Right. So maybe there's some assimilation processes here, or maybe they still feel distinct. For now, we know that we think Latinx and African American should be particularly threatened by the police. So we say negativity bias. If you have high negativity bias and you're African American or Latinx, you're going to be more liberal on policing and criminal justice issues. Sorry, I have to remind myself that in going through these hypotheses, what I'm ultimately going to show you is a lack of support for these. So don't get your hopes up or like actually adjust your thinking based on my theory here. But I have reasons why I think that what we're doing now will get a better sense of this. Immigration, okay, foreigners and immigrants who seem to be a threat. So harsh immigration laws are a protection from that threat. Latinx and Asian Americans, right, have strong in reality but in their how they're stereotyped and seen, right? Immigration ties. Even when you're not an immigrant, there's the forever foreigner stereotype. So everywhere you go, people ask you where you're from. You're like Jersey. I'm like, no, where are you really from, right? So that's the forever foreigner stereotype. So immigration and border patrol agents, a strong border, might be seen differently by Latinx and Asian American groups compared to white people and even African Americans, where that's kind of a fuzzy one, but this has been the focus of some literature recently in race, like this sort of tension, African American and Latino being pitted against one another, belongingness to being an American and stuff like that. Economic redistribution, welfare is highly racialized, traditionally on like the black-white dichotomy, but we're seeing it more with Latinx as well. There's some citations, some research suggesting, right, Latinos are also part of the racialization of welfare and government assistance now. Again, the same complexities exist for Asian Americans because we know there are these assimilation processes. We know the model minority stereotype is going to push them in a certain direction and how they experience the world. But at the same time, they are a minority, and there's like work on like, the economic discrimination they can also feel depending on which group in East or in Asia you're talking about. And religious conservatism, finally, the idea is that the nuclear family and religious traditions, and the idea that, like, really, if you talk to like Jeff Greenberg over in psychology, that like terror management theory, this idea that like religion offers, well, I don't know if he says religion, I'm pretty sure he's talking about religion, but you build these ideologies and religion, I assume, to give yourself meaning in life because you're afraid of dying and it meaning nothing afterward. Right. So you cling to these traditions, religious values, and things like that. But why would my race and ethnicity come into play? Well, churches and religious organizations are not race neutral places. We know that especially amongst non-white churches and churches, they promote shared racial identity, they promote shared racial consciousness, and they often connect those things to politics. And so we think maybe this whole, also like just historically, right, like the use of gender and sexual norms as a religious thing, a lot of people would say that that's more often just been a pretext for Western Europeans to colonize everybody else and say, you know, like, oh, you need to be like us and have these gender norms as a tool for colonization. I don't think the average person is thinking about that or aware of that at all, but it does suggest that maybe this connection between being religious and being conservative about gender and sex might be a white thing, particularly. Although, well, I don't know. There's a back and forth that we've got to do more on the paper on that. Maybe it's just whites, right? But for everybody else, there's no relationship maybe between negativity bias and conservatism. All right, sorry, I feel like I don't know how I'm doing on time. Okay, so I think I'm doing good. So study one is this paper that came out in 2022. The caveats of this study are that, so it's a registered report. So there's a big move in psychology and now political psychology too, to do pre-registration, put everything, your hypotheses, your theory, the analyses you're going to do, who you're going to omit, what significance level, you know, corrections to your p-values you're going to do, everything into a pre-registration they accept based on that. And we fooled them into accepting our pre-registration. They accepted our pre-registration, so they had to publish it regardless of what we found, right? Which I think, you know, that there's a lot of benefits to this, but it was based on a pre-registered report. It is online data collection only because so this was actually sort of like a miscalculation. So the timeline was absurd compared to what we actually had to do. Bring in 174 people to the lab and run them. And the timeline that they gave us was much shorter than that. So we had to resort to not doing that, which we're doing now. But this paper, we had to do an audible and collect only online data, which is going to severely limit our data. So for this in particular, so we couldn't do physiology, obviously, through online, but we did a memory recall test. We showed people a bunch of pictures and saw what they remembered most. We also, because of the original pre-registration was going to be in person, and we were going to we know that there's not a huge African-American population in Tucson. We didn't put that in the pre-registration, so we only have white, Asian American, and Latinx participants in this study. Not in the current study, though, we are running all 4 groups. But for this, so 174 participants, MTurk, I don't know how many of you are familiar with this. It's an online crowdsourcing survey platform. The data are not great, but they're not terrible, I think is the way I would put it. You can pay people to complete your surveys and get a decent sample. We evenly recruited Asian Americans, Latinx, non-Hispanic, white, and well, that's it. And I'll come back to this if you want, but there's some demographics here about the different populations. They do vary a bit on these other demographics. Control for them, but maybe it means more. We measured negativity bias with this memory task. So we look at the difference in recall, or your percentage of accurate memory for pictures that were negative compared to positive. We had 200 pictures from a few databases, 50 each that were threatening, snakes and spiders or knives and guns, disgusting. This is actually one of my old advisors. I'm not showing you the actual images because like they say don't show them outside. I don't really care, but I try not to. They say don't show them outside of the study to not dilute. Like a lot of people, researchers have now seen the IAPS pictures because they're shown in presentations all the time. So I don't know, he definitely didn't need to do this. But for some presentation he was doing, is like, we need to recreate the picture of the guy eating worms. So I guess I'm gonna have to eat a bunch of worms. And we're like, yeah, I don't think you need to. And he's like, yes, I'm going to eat the worms. And we're like, what about gummy worms? No, so he's eating real worms there. And that picture will haunt him forever, as it should. But that's not a picture of, so we have bodily mutilation, mutilated bodies and stuff. So not that. I just didn't want to freak you guys out. It would be like real bad, like severed limbs, burn wounds, and things like that. I don't think that's like a little scratch, but that's a category. Neutral, like a plate or that guy. Positive. Sorry, those aren't the actual pictures. What happened positive? Oh, babies and beautiful scenery. Okay, so people study the images they go by for 2 seconds each for 124 of them. And then the test phase, they show 200 images. We showed 200 images, and they have to tell me whether they saw it before or not. Correct recall means they correctly identified that they saw it before. Overall, people remembered 72.5% of the images correctly. It's actually a little bit lower than what some previous research had found, but that's to be expected because it was online and they're in their apartments or bedrooms or whatever. On average, the neutral images were about 72.4. Positive images were remembered less than the neutral, and disgusting images were remembered the most. One weird thing here is that threat was somewhere between, was actually the lowest, sorry. The lowest recall, which was totally unexpected. But this is a common theme in our results. What you see is that disgust seems to be doing all the work here, as opposed to threat. Race, so this I'm happy to talk more about and hear what you guys think, but so we had to think of the rules for categorizing people into these discrete racial categories, despite that not really being how the world works often. But Latinx, we just put, so anybody who's not African American or Asian American, I don't know why Asian American. We didn't have anybody in our sample actually that identified as both. Now I remember. So I was like, this could be a problem, but thankfully we didn't have anybody that fit that category. So there was like 2 or 3 that were African American and Latinx, but all the other Latinx either had said other or white, which is a common finding in that literature. Asian Americans had to select Asian American only. Whites had to select white only and could not be Latinx. And African Americans, if you selected African American, and so I don't know if I have it in the appendix. I don't think I have an appendix, but some in the paper, right? Like we looked at different combinations here. The results don't change much, but conservatism, we measured in a bunch of different ways. So the graphs I'm going to show you in just a second here are going to show you multiple measures of conservatism for each issue domain. And basically, it's just us trying to be as robust as possible. There's these Wilson-Patterson, see, I told you, late 60s, this measure of just policy attitudes. Okay, are you pro or against abortion and pro or against welfare, and like just averaging it up across a bunch of different. Actually, in this, we always specified the issue, but it's just an average of policy attitudes, as opposed to the more validated measures that are a little bit more like Likert scale items where you agree or disagree with a whole sentence. So for policing the criminal justice system, there's this punitive attitude scale from Dowler 2003, which is all about like the death penalty and mandatory minimums and like how harsh should our criminal justice system be. Perceptions of the police, on the other hand, we kept these separate. There's 2 subscales of this, but they don't really work differently most of the time. But it's your attitude towards the police, right? How you feel about the police in general, but also how much you think they're biased against racial minorities. Immigration, there was a bunch of more, the Wilson-Patterson, but also this attitude towards immigration scale that's been used before, specific policies and how you think immigrants affect the United States. Are they a good benefit or a threat? Economic redistribution, we used a bunch of items about your support for redistributing wealth and raising the taxes on the rich and increasing government assistance to the poor and things like that. And religious conservatism was really sort of what we usually measure as social ideology. I didn't want it to just be religiosity, right? It has to be the like conservative politically. And so this was like your attitude towards abortion and gay marriage and LGBT issues and things like that. I'm not going to spend time on this, but it's here. If you want to see the demographics or the breakdown across racial groups for the averages on each of these. I'm definitely not going to spend time on this for the sake of time, but this is, if you want to see our equation, see how it was actually modeled, you can look at it. But we did a multi-level analysis, multi-level model where, I misspelled correct. Oops, that's in the published paper. Whoops. But the trial is the unit of analysis. So the probability of getting it correct modeled as a function of all these other things, but of most interest, a three-way interaction between whether or not that image was disgusting, threatening, neutral, or positive, their conservatism, and their racial or ethnic identity. And so these are the results. And what we're finding, okay, so let me explain. On the left-hand panels with like the gray shaded regions, these are all marginal effects plots, actually. And so on the y-axis is the effect of, what is it the effect of? The effect of, oh, right, the effect of this category compared to positive. So it's not your level of recall, it's how much more, if you have higher on this scale, I know that online people can't see my finger, but if you look at the disgust panels, for example, higher on the y-axis means you remember disgusting images better than positive images more. Lower means you remember them less than positive images more, and 0 means about the same. And then on the right side is when we split it up by race. So the left side panels don't split it up by race at all, just so we can see, is negativity bias associated with conservatism in our data? And then the right side says, does this differ across race? So is the effect, is the marginal effect more positive, more negative, or neither across the three racial groups, which are the red dots are white, the blue dots are Latinx, and the green dots are Asian American. And yeah.
Can I ask, is the x-axis standard deviations on the scale?
That's a good question. No, it is mean-centered ideology. Actually, on the left plots panels, right? It is mean-centered, and it had been transformed from, I want to say 0 to 1. No, yeah, I think 0 to 1, and then mean-centered. So, yeah, 0 is the mean, and then, but it's not standardized. But that is the full scale on the x-axis there, which yeah, it's not the same exact x-axis across them. There was a couple of things in the plots where I was like, man, we should have fixed that for the publication. But yes, so that's just conservatism, the full range from left to right. And yeah, so for the dot plots with race, if the dot is above 0, it means that racial group had a higher likelihood of negativity bias, had a higher negativity bias. And lower means that group had I'm sorry, not negativity bias necessarily, but they remembered that category more. And that's, no, wait, no, that's all right. It's the, it's the two-way interaction between conservatism and negativity bias. So higher numbers means negativity bias was related to conservatism. 0 means negativity bias had no relationship with conservatism, and negative numbers means negativity bias was negatively related to conservatism for that racial group. So across the board here, I'll kind of point you to my interpretation of the main results here. Mostly no, okay? But a couple things. One thing is that people actually remembered neutral images a lot better than positive. Well, never mind, that's sort of a tangent. I'm not even gonna, but it was still, but they remembered neutral images largely better than threatening. So threatening was weird either because there's something about a threat, or I think honestly more likely the threatening images just don't get people as much as the disgusting images. But disgust is really doing the work here. And I don't want to say that just because that's where there's some results, because if you look at threats, it's flat lines. And that is true generally for each racial group as well, except in maybe a couple places. But really disgust, but this is negative. And what that tells us is that the more conservative people got, the less they had a negativity bias in favor of disgust, in the category of disgust. So what's going on? That's the opposite of what all this existing literature would tell us. Well, who's it coming from in terms of racial groups? Most of these interactions were not significant, so we can't really say that it's moderated by race or ethnicity at all. But if we get close, it tends to be white people that are driving that. Okay, yeah, you might be, well, I don't want to prime your thinking on interpreting that, so I'm not going to mention that more. I mean, honestly, your ideas are like, I have no horse in this race, really. Immigration, same kind of thing, although a little bit flatter, right? This was policing and criminal justice. the more disgust sensitive they were, the less conservative, particularly amongst whites, if anything is happening here. Immigration, we really see nothing going on here. Again, maybe a couple places where white people have the opposite of what you would predict. Economic redistribution, depending on the measure, it's either basically nothing, or on business, attitudes towards big business and welfare recipients, like kind of coded so that higher values being more conservative. Again, if anything, you have people that are really disgust sensitive being less conservative, and that really being the case amongst white people in particular. Religious conservatism, same kind of thing. Although maybe we see something for neutral going on here, and I have no clue how to even start interpreting that. But again, it doesn't significantly vary across race and ethnicity. I think maybe power problem, but really, if there is an effect there, it's small. So there's no support for our main hypothesis about moderation by race or ethnicity generally, although I kind of, the other stuff about disgust and white people, I think is maybe hinted at in the data. But there's also was not really much of a link between negativity bias and conservatism here. So in fact, some conservatism in some cases was associated with lower negativity bias. Maybe there's no link. Maybe it's much more dependent on the salient issues of the day, how the issues are framed in media and by politicians, and social influence, things like that. Or also, these are not the best data. We were doing a memory task with MTurk respondents, which is far from ideal. So that's a study. Don't worry, I'm not going to go through a whole new thing about study 2. It's just like, and now study 2 is getting at this. So we have in-person data collection. We have a mixed student and community sample. We're actually live seeing the people. These aren't just, like MTurk workers, in their apartment all day. We're including African Americans in our sample now, and now we have physiological data. So that's what we've been collecting. We have like 30 people's worth of data, and I analyzed it. I could show you like a mean, but like that's all I have right now. But it's ongoing. Our goal is about a bit over 200 people. And the EDA measures, we're showing people 32 pictures, but each for 12 whole seconds each. Oh wait, threatening, discussing, neutral, positive, with 20 seconds in between. This is pretty standard in EDA research because it physiological response, EDA can take a long time to respond. It's a slow burn, kind of like you see the image and you generally will see people's reactivity start to go up, and it can take like 10 seconds or so for it to really go back down to baseline. And that's if you have a clean measurement. So we're taking the mean of their skin conductance for every half second from 2 to 10 seconds after the stimulus is shown, and subtracting that from the mean skin conductance when at the very first second that instance that the stimulus is shown. That's our model. If you want to dig into it, it's the same thing, trial level data, but with all this three-way interaction is really, yeah. So this is the memory recall with 40 people. Okay, take it with a huge grain of salt. But what I find interesting is that already in our data, this disgust thing is already happening again. And I really can't advise anybody to trust the differences. I don't even split it up in all these categories racially right now because we only have 40 people. So I just say white and non-white, including Latinos in the non-white category. And it really is white people, again, that are driving this weird disgust sensitivity leads to less conservatism finding. It's not really, that's policing. And so the strongest are definitely criminal justice and policing. So that's where it gives me a hint to focus that in my theorizing, but also like it's not happening that much in immigration, but I think race and ethnicity probably has a much greater role there. Economics, not really much going on. Actually, but that top left with economic policies like conservatism associated with lower disgust sensitivity and lower threat sensitivity, and lower neutral sensitivity. So I don't know what that means. This is the only one. This is the only one where you see this line go positive. Flat when it comes to the Wilson-Patterson, but if you look at the other scales we have for religious conservatism, who knows, maybe it's just an artifact of multiple analyses, but the more conservative you are, the more disgust sensitive you are when it comes to issues of religious conservatism, And that's really the case, sorry for these lines, across the board, well, kind of across the board racially, and again, take it with a huge grain of salt, but actually non-white people tend to even have that higher than white people. So much so that in my super quick making of these plots, I didn't expand the y-axis enough to capture them on there. Okay, so people varying negativity bias. It feels to me like this should be related to politics. And some research said that, but other research now is challenging that. And my own findings are kind of challenging how I thought about it. We know that negative news and campaigning works, right? Fear mongering and trying to use fear to stoke mobilization and change people's political attitudes. And there's a vast literature on how effective that can be. We know that race is fundamental to how you see the world and political institutions and policies. So the goal really here is fairly open. I'm still keeping myself kind of neutral in terms of my horse in the race. You know, if I start going against what my advisors found, I could feel good about that. Honestly, better than if I started doing the same, because people would be like, oh, he's just doing what his advisors already did. But I don't know what's happening. The goal is to find what parts of one's physiological makeup are interacting with racial hierarchy, but also their political preferences. Maybe there's some framing studies that we can do, look at what the salient issues for people are, the most important issues, and maybe that sheds some light. I don't know why I show people skydiving. I think PowerPoint did that by default. So I'm looking forward to continuing to get data from the Lang Lab. Sorry, I was hoping that I would talk for shorter than that. I'm always advising everybody to remember, brevity in your talks, and then I just ramble. I want to thank Rongbo, Ian, Fatsi, the rest of PIP Lab, people who are here, and others, SGPP, my research funds, but the Politics and Life Sciences Association is what funded that first study. And critically, you all, the Francis McClellan Institute and the Lang Lab, and Melissa and Bianca and Robert Lanza, and who else was here from IT that have been helping me a lot. Yeah, thank you. Does this end at 2 or
2:15?
Okay,
yeah.
Right. But also, you guys are busy, man. So you gotta go.
I have a quick
Sorry.
question. I was interested in your comment that maybe the threatening photos aren't that threatening. And I was curious if now that you're actually seeing people in the lab, are people reacting to the threat images, and how does that compare to the reaction to the disgust images?
Honestly, it's, so it's totally anecdotal, but people react to the disgust images.
Mm-hmm.
The threat images, so I will say one thing is that I kind of expected that maybe the memory task would get around this a bit, because I thought one of the reasons that the physiology component wasn't replicating was because it's actually really hard to get a physiological reaction out of people. And so you really have to sort of hit them on the head with this stimulus. And, you often run into problems with certain types of stimuli are just fundamentally more arousing than others. But what hitting the guy eating worms, I'm sure that's not how you'd want to be known, but it's started a lot of this literature. He sort of adjusted his theory in the face of those replication failures. He has adjusted his theory, fairly conveniently, that it's not really about how you react to negative things in your environment. It's about how aware of them you are. So he kind of was setting it up to be well, maybe the physiology part doesn't replicate, but the other stuff should. And now the memories part's not replicating either. In a bad mTurk sample, but starting to not replicate in this sample too, and who knows, but so I don't know if it's an arousal thing or if it's just disgusting things capture people more. Is that what you kind of thought?
I mean, sure, I think disgusting images are more, they provoke more of a reaction, right, than a snake. Well, I mean, unless you have a snake phobia, I suppose. But yeah, so I guess that was kind of what I was wondering, is if you were seeing that in the physiological response too, that do the threat images have any impact?
I have to look to see what this was in response to, but we take notes on any weird things that happen when the participants are in there. Several of them have closed their eyes.
Mhm.
A couple have asked, when's this going to be over?
Mhm.
So, you know, I have some IRB forms to fill out, but,
Mhm.
and we try to be we're very upfront, like, you know, don't have to if you can't, but it does, I think it's the disgust images that are really doing that.
Mhm.
You go first. No, thank you. I was
Sorry.
wondering if every respondents have been exposed to the same images of threats, or was it varied?
Ours were all the same images. It was randomly ordered. In a random order. I think we put a constraint on it, so like 3 images of the same valence couldn't be shown in a row. But other than that, random, but the same. But compared to other studies, there were a lot of, so we actually chose the images from other studies, but there was a mix of multiple studies. So it wasn't the exact same images that any one other study used, but a mix of all of them.
So I asked because I think threat is, particularly in the politics realm, is kind of constructed, right, for each group. Because I think race and ethnicity kind of
I'm gonna take notes.
race and ethnicity kind of plays a role in this aspect, because each race and ethnicity group are probably having different stories, different myths from the previous generation, and those myths and stories have been transferred from one generation to the another. And I think the social factors kind of plays a role in this aspect to, you know, formulation of threats for each group, right? For example, while I was coding for direction disinformation operations, I realized that for the Black group, the threats thing is most of the time police brutality and law enforcement forces. But for example, for the white audience, it's most of the time immigration, as you were talking about. I mean, irregular migrants, Muslims sometimes, and such things. So the threats are very much constructed. And in the politics, I think I kind of feel like you might have found different outcomes if each group have been exposed to those kind of related threat conceptions.
Yeah. No, I like that idea a lot. And sorry, I'm not texting. I'm taking notes, and I just forgot paper. So in the realm of threat, maybe the stimuli should be more specific to politics, more political. Yeah, I like that idea a lot.
A similar thought along that lines too with the neutral pictures. Like one of the good example was just like a white guy, but like that isn't really politically neutral.
Oh, that guy wasn't actually in there, but yeah, he was triggering to me. I typed in average guy, and of course the fact that I typed in average guy and that's what came up triggered me. But yeah.
Tying to both of these comments, I was going to ask, was the selection of pictures validated across various groups for you to say, like, yes, this is in fact disgusting to various groups, and like that's what they would consider? Because, for example, that was my first reaction when I saw that picture too. I was like, that doesn't seem neutral to me, you know?
Right.
Or even the word picture, actually. I wouldn't necessarily consider it disgusting, considering that certain groups actually have that as a delicacy to eat. So like thinking about validation and that around the scale.
Yeah, it's interesting because that was sort of one of the justifications for getting away from political stimuli, was the idea that it's subjective. And so, but as the psychology, well, I don't know how close to psychology anyway. Well, I was trained in psychology, so I feel like I can say this. I think they don't consider those like variations a lot, and like so there's this universalistic explanation sort of model in psychology, and so like this is disgust, this is disgusting, and it's universal because we did it like in a small student sample in 3 countries, and kind of thing. And so yeah, like how much I could
Like, can you have somebody like
Yeah,
show a picture and say, categorize it? and
Yeah.
See how often and if there are variations in categorization.
yeah, I could do that. I'm just trying to think, I wish I could do that in the current data, but I can't. But I could. And I probably should do that, because that's another, I mean, I'm not, like, that wouldn't be like a, like, I would be happy to find that the interpretations of these things as disgusting, threatening, or what have you are fundamentally different. Yeah.
Were the statistical models adjusted for education?
Yeah, let me, oh, that's not, sorry.
Because it seems like a big part of what would drive this threat response is education rather than race and ethnicity. And
Okay,
if you're really interested in race and ethnicity, then adjusting for education would make that effect
let me
More
see.
testable.
Yeah, we had education in there, but who knows, right? I mean, like, I didn't really look at it much. How do you figure education?
Well, I would think
Going into
that education and conservatism are correlated with one another, right? So if you adjust it for education, then
It is, yeah, there have been findings looking at that. So being able to partial that out so that you're only looking at the racial part.
right,
just
the
kind of removing
variation
another
attributable
potential
to race and
compound.
ethnicity rather than the confounding of race and ethnicity in education,
Yeah.
right? So, I mean, if your
Yeah.
model adjusts for that, then
Well,
it's probably.
It only controls for the main effect. And so it's not controlling for any interactions with education. So I still could do that. And so, yeah, I mean, generally education is related to being left of center. But that also can be more complicated when you break it down by race. And so, yeah, I wonder how.
Maybe looking into that
Yeah.
a little bit more. And my other idea was in terms of like methods, potentially like latent class or latent profile analyses, because you have all of these different kinds of conservatism.
Mhm.
Like if you could actually identify the heterogeneous subgroups and the different kinds of conservatism,
Yeah.
and use that as the predictor.
I like
Rather
that a
than,
lot.
I think that would like, it's kind of dimensional reduction where you'd have fewer p-values and you'd have to like not do your Bonferroni or whatever adjustment you did.
Yeah.
It would be less conservative, so maybe you find more. And then there'd probably be something interesting about these underlying subgroups of different kinds of conservatism. Like some people are conservative on
Yeah.
police stuff, but not religious stuff, and vice versa.
Yeah. I like that a lot because I certainly have enough survey items to do it, which is not always the case when people measure ideology. So yeah, there's been some work like using LCA and other things like that to break down ideology into its components, and some have found even up to like 6, different dimensions. Yeah, I could a bigger sample.
Yeah.
But a trial level analyses, so it could still work.
No, but do we have anybody online? I see like a
Oh.
thing for the
Yeah,
chat. I don't know if there were any.
not-
Just want to make sure we don't forget them.
not yet, yeah.
Oh,
The chat message was just if anyone had any questions. So we haven't had any in the Q&A or the chats yet.
I'm gonna ask you guys a question. Why do you think it makes sense that sensitivity might be related to being more liberal in some cases? Like, that's what I'm finding now. So I don't know. My mind goes to COVID. I didn't want to contaminate your thoughts.
This is not my field at all, and I have no idea if this is.
That's
just
exactly
pop
why I want-
psychology Or if there's actually literature here, but what I think of is this is pop psychology, but there's sort of this movement now to identify highly sensitive people. And I feel like that does, in the pop psychology telling at least, align with an unwillingness to even view uncomfortable images. And And I don't know how that necessarily relates to a liberal versus conservative political ideology, but I do think, again, like in the general population, liberal people are more tolerant of sensitivity among especially children, boys in particular, and sort of a willingness to honor that dislike of uncomfortable images. I don't know what that's worth or if that's useful, but that's, you know, from a totally lay perspective on just
No,
how
that's,
people talk about sensitivity, and particularly around images, right? Like there's sort of like a parenting movement around not forcing children to see uncomfortable, scary, you know, movies too early because they're, you know, we don't want them to confront that.
that's my new hypothesis.
I think when I heard you talk, it started to bring ideas of like being more sensitive, maybe linked to like conscientiousness and like being more like aware of things. And so being more aware of like discomfort of others or discomforting things. So like making you more prone to see those things. Kind of could be linked to that potentially, but also I think we need to, I would be a little bit careful to say that like there's a tendency for this over the other ones, because it's really disgust over positive, right? So like maybe also comparing disgust over threat and like who is more focused on which one. So like having your contrast code be different might also be of interest, just to truly say like it is disgust proneness versus another one, right?
Yeah.
It made me think, like, did you examine non-linearities in conservatism? Because like we think, like we have this dichotomous polar opposite kind of thing where it's actually more of like a circle for people on both sides of like the extremes might be more similar to one another, where like that might actually, you might be able to fit a better model. Now, whether it's significant or not, who knows, but thinking about conservatism is non-linear, or that association, I should say, being non-linear. Because I could see really far right and really far left being more sensitive to exposures to things and different things they're more sensitive to, but maybe there's that sort of like hypersensitivity on both sides of the spectrum, or you know, on different sides.
I was also thinking too, kind of maybe a future study measuring empathy and also analyzing your images, because for example, like a mutilated body, you bring up human suffering and people may be thinking about that versus vomit, right? Like, so those are really different kinds of disgust and and maybe triggering something very different. And even similarly threat, like a spider versus a gun pointing at you, those are, you know, different forms of threat, and they may interact with empathy towards others.
Or like victimization, like
Yes.
who is the target of the mutilation?
We can look at this because I can separate the images. And there are certainly images that come close to one versus the other. And we can probably, like, vomit is not, there's a lot of poop. There's a lot of poop in the images. And I think I can make that a clean representation of the non-human suffering. And then there are some that are clearly suffering. And the extreme, so yeah, there's actually a literature outside of this on, no, actually some of the critiques of this have been it's ideological extremism, not conservatism that you're looking at. And so folding it, I could easily do, and just looking at extremism in either direction. And there would be plenty of theory to rest that on too. I think that was my alarm to go do the next.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you all for coming, and thank you so much. This was interesting. Gave us all
Thanks, Melissa.
to think about.
Yeah, and yeah, I'll be down there if anybody ever stops by Lang Lab. we'll never, well, usually honestly, for graduate students, but.
Well, again, thank you so much.